Okay, so why don't we get started? Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Courtney Doggard. I'm the president of Network 2020. It's a pleasure today to have Michael Koplow with us to talk about the Israeli elections, the many of them that have happened over the past year and what to expect. And some of you may have just seen a news alert that showed that our timing could not have been better. So I'm going to leave it to Michael to explain what all of this means. He is the policy director of the Israel Policy Forum. And before coming to the Israel Policy Forum, he was the founding program director of the Israel Institute. He holds a PhD in government from Georgetown University, where he specialized in political development and ideology in the politics of Middle Eastern states. He writes Israel Policy Forum's weekly Koplow column and edits the Israel Policy Exchange, which is a leading source for commentary and analysis on Israel and American Jewry, and his work regularly appears in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, and The Forward, among other populations. He also has a BA from Brandeis, a JD from New York University, and an AM in Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard. So you are hoarding all of the degrees and all of the excellent schools. So we are quite lucky to have Michael with us today to explain what to expect from the elections.
Thanks so much, Courtney. So as you alluded to, today is fortuitous timing, since as of about an hour ago, there appears to be an agreement for a new Israeli government, something that we've been waiting for over a year. Israel has gone through 3 elections in the last year. The first one was last April, April 9th, if memory serves me correctly. And since then, Israel has basically been in a state of really political crisis, where no side could form a government. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about the past year, the lead up to where we got to how we got to where we are today, and why things seem to now have broken just today. This deadlock now seems to be over. So, following the election, the first one, back last April 2019, what you had was what looked like a right-wing bloc that would be able to form a government. In Israel's system, the Knesset is 120 members. You need 61 to form a government. And after the last election, or the first election rather, in April, it looked like Prime Minister Netanyahu had 65 seats to form a government. And those 65 seats comprised parties that had been either sitting with him in coalition right when elections were called, or parties that had been part of his coalitions in the past. And so what most people, myself included, expected was that the prime minister would form a 65-seat government, and that really the wrangling was just over who would get which ministries and some policy issues. But it turned out that 5 of those 65 seats were held by Avigdor Lieberman. Avigdor Lieberman had been the defense minister in the Netanyahu government. He had resigned about a year before the elections. And one of the things that he was demanding was that there be reform in terms of how the state treats its ultra-Orthodox citizens. He wanted, first of all, ultra-Orthodox citizens to be subject to the IDF draft, which is currently not the case and really has not been in Israel's history. And he also, because he represents, he himself is a Russian immigrant, or I should say a Moldovan immigrant from the former Soviet Union, he represents, his party represents Soviet immigrants to Israel. There are about somewhere between 1.1 and 1.3 million Israeli citizens who come from former Soviet countries, and they tend to be secular. And so he also wanted there to be fewer restrictions imposed on Israeli Jews by the chief rabbinate, mainly having to do with conversion and marriage and who's counted as a Jew. Now, in the past, Lieberman, as I said, has sat in governments with Netanyahu and also with the ultra-Orthodox parties, who are Netanyahu's favorite and most reliable coalition partners. And so most people assumed that there would be this haggling and they would come to some sort of agreement as they've done in the past. Ultimately, it turns out that Lieberman this time was serious. He was not willing to back down on his policy demands. The ultra-Orthodox parties as well were not willing to back down, given that they enjoyed the status quo. And Netanyahu seemed to kind of realize this at the very last moment, and and there was really not enough time for him to try to force the issue and force one of the two sides to compromise. And so no government was formed, and Israel went to a second election. Now, the second election was in September of last year. And after the second election, the largest opposition party, Blue and White, which is headed by Benny Gantz, emerged with not only the most seats, they ended up then with 33 seats to Likud's 32 seats, but Gantz seemed to control a bigger bloc. Now, when we talk about the blocks in this case, it isn't really a right-wing bloc versus a left-wing bloc. What the blocks were in these three elections were a pro-Netanyahu bloc and an anti-Netanyahu bloc. Blue and White was a brand new party last April. It was the first election that that party had ever contested because it was a brand new party. It actually had not existed 2 months before that April election. And that party was formed by Benny Gantz, who is a former Israel Defense Forces Chief of Staff, Gabi Ashkenazi, who is a former Israel Defense Forces Chief of Staff, Moshe Ya'alon, who is a former Israel Defense Forces Chief of Staff, and Yair Lapid, who is the head of a party called Yesh Atid. He's a politician who's been on the scene for about a decade, kind of a well-known secular politician. He served as finance minister under Netanyahu between 2013 and 2015. But he and Netanyahu generally are at odds and are not considered to be part of the same bloc. So you had this new party that was formed, headed by these four men. And the reason the party was formed was because Prime Minister Netanyahu was under investigation for a series of bribery and corruption cases. And the police had recommended to the Attorney General that he be indicted. And that process was ongoing. And Netanyahu had not been indicted before the first election, but those indictments were coming. Everybody knew about it. And Blue and White formed as a party that said, listen, Netanyahu has been in office for a decade, and he's about to be under indictment on 3 separate cases, and it's time for a change. And so you had this pro-Netanyahu bloc and anti-Netanyahu bloc. Now, because the opposition as it is was an anti-Netanyahu bloc that wasn't necessarily held together by uniform policy, what it meant was that after the second election, despite the fact that Blue and White had the most seats, and despite the fact that you had over 60 seats in the anti-Netanyahu bloc, the parties in that bloc really ranged the gamut from some very, very right-wing members of parliament to traditional members of the Israeli peace camp to the Joint List, which is an amalgamation of 4 mostly Arab parties. You have these big political differences, and after the second election, while Benny Gantz was given the mandate to try to form a government first, ultimately he wasn't able to do it because it would have meant either including the Joint List in a government, something that has not happened in Israel's history and something that is still taboo for many, many Israeli Jewish voters. And I should also add taboo for many of the Joint List voters and even more strikingly, the Joint List politicians who represent anti-Zionist voters and anti-Zionist parties. And so historically, they have not been willing to join the government, even if Israeli Jewish parties would have them, because to do so would be to legitimate Zionism. So you had on both sides this issue of including the Joint List in the government. Without the Joint List and its seats, which were 13 seats after the second election, you couldn't get to that magic number of 61. Now, there's another option, which was to have the Joint List support a Benny Gantz government from the outside. In that case, you'd have a minority government that would require the Joint List for 2 votes. One, the first vote to make Benny Gantz prime minister and form a government. And 2 would be to pass a budget, because in Israel, if a government can't pass the budget, it automatically dissolves. So you would have needed a Joint List to support a minority government twice. And then after that, they could vote how they please, and the Benny Gantz government would stay. That was also a bit of an uphill battle, not only because the Joint List wasn't sure if they were willing to do it, but because Avigdor Lieberman wasn't sure if he was willing to sit in the government with outside Joint List support, and because you had 2 very right-wing members of Blue and White, Yoas Hendel and Zvi Hauser, who themselves are 2 of maybe the most right-wing members of the Knesset, but they do not like Netanyahu. They actually both worked for him in the past. Like many people who have worked for Netanyahu had a big falling out with him and now want to see him gone. So they also, for ideological reasons, weren't willing to sit in a government that was supported by the Joint List. And so Benny Gantz ultimately wasn't able to form a government. Neither was Netanyahu, because he wasn't. He at that point he only had 55 members of his right-wing bloc, and so Israel went to a third election. After the third election, which was this past March, Netanyahu's situation improved a bit. He ended up with Likud being the largest party again, and with 58 members of the right-wing bloc. So again, still not enough to form a government, but he was getting closer. Benny Gantz, because there were 62 members of the anti-Netanyahu bloc, he was again given the mandate to form a government first. But he ran into the same problem that he ran into after election number 2, which was he didn't have a clear path to do it without the Joint List. This time his margins were smaller because he had 62 members of the anti-Netanyahu bloc. These two very right-wing members of Knesset from his own party, Hendel and Hauser, definitively came out and said publicly that they would not sit in a government that included the Joint List, and they would also not sit in a minority government that had the outside support of the Joint List. And since Gantz was working with a 62-member anti-Netanyahu bloc, once those two MKs from his own party said they weren't willing to go the minority government route, it was effectively off the table for him, because then you wouldn't even have 61 votes from minority government. So that option was gone. And so what Gantz was left with were two possibilities. Possibility number one was to join a unity government with Netanyahu and Likud. And again, it's important to remember that Blue and White's entire reason for being, the reason the party was formed, the reason that they received so many votes. Blue and White received over 1 million votes each of the 3 elections, which Likud did too. But remember, Likud has been around essentially since the beginning of the state. Blue and White is literally a brand new party that did not exist 15 months ago. So sitting with Netanyahu seemed as if it would be a violation of the party's reason for being. And then option number 3 would be to go to a 4th election. Now, in a normal environment, let's put it this way. After election number 1, I was pretty certain that Netanyahu would get his 65 seats. Didn't happen. So we went to election number 2. After election number 2, I was certain there would not be a 3rd election, because already the 2nd election was unprecedented in Israeli history. The idea that that anybody would agree to do this a 3rd time seemed like insanity. This time around, there was a 3rd election, so what's a 4th, right? Keep it up. The difference this time, of course, is that in Israel, as in everywhere else around the world, you have a crisis with coronavirus, and the country is shut down. The economy is tanking, as it is everywhere else. Israel has actually dealt, based on the numbers, Israel has actually dealt from a public health perspective with coronavirus pretty successfully. Seems to be on par with some of the most successful countries that we've seen around the world, whether it be South Korea, Singapore, New Zealand. Deaths are down, the infection rates are down. Israel pretty quickly took very severe, not just social distancing, but lockdowns. And so the government seems to be dealing with it pretty well. But the economy has really tanked, and elections are expensive. And because Israel has been operating with transitional governments now for a year, what it means under Israeli law is that you can pass a new budget. And so what happens is that every month, 1/12 of the last budget that was passed gets allocated to all the different ministries, and so they can't be increased. And obviously, we've seen, for instance, in the U.S., huge stimulus packages being passed by the Congress. In Israel, that can't happen right now. It just has to be every month is 1/12 of the previous budget, and it goes on and on like that. So going to a 4th election seemed particularly drastic, even when you leave aside the fact that we're already in completely uncharted waters for Israel politically. And so faced with joining with Netanyahu or going to a 4th election, Benny Gantz a couple of weeks ago publicly announced that he was entering into unity talks with Netanyahu. What that did was that it immediately broke apart Blue and White as a party. Blue and White as I said, had 4 co-chiefs representing 3 different parties that all joined together to form this one. And so Gantz and Ashkenazi, 2 of the former chiefs of staff, they went off in one direction, and Moshe Ya'alon and Yair Lapid went off in another direction. And so this party fractured. And so now you had a situation where Gantz broke up the main opposition party, but he did it before he actually had an agreement in hand for a unity government. And so Netanyahu then basically sort of had all the leverage, right? Because he could either form a unity government with Gantz, or he could risk going to a 4th election knowing that the opposition was now gone. The opposition party that had won 1 million votes 3 times in a row and was controlling over 30 seats in the Knesset was now split into two different pieces. And not only that, half of the party that was constructed to be an anti-Netanyahu party had now, publicly said, we're okay sitting with Netanyahu, even though he is actually now formally under indictment, which happened between election number 2 and election number 3. And he actually has a court date that was supposed to be in March, but because of coronavirus was postponed until May. So he's officially under indictment, and Gantz said that he was willing to form a unity government with him anyway because of the coronavirus crisis. So that happened a couple of weeks ago, and the unity government talks seem to be going not so well. Gantz had set a bunch of red lines, and some of them he walked back, such as annexation of the West Bank, something that he said that he was going to prevent. He seemed to quickly cave on that. But the thing that he wasn't willing to cave on was a set of issues having to do with the judiciary, basically having to do with how judges are appointed in Israel. There's a 9-person. I can go into the nitty gritty, but basically there's a 9-person committee that appoints judges. Gantz, and it's comprised of current Supreme Court justices, members of the Israeli Bar Association, members of the government, and members of the Knesset. So basically, Netanyahu wanted to change the way judges are appointed, partially because he is still hoping that when he if he gets convicted and he appeals to the High Court, that an appeal will go his way, and partially because he wants to make sure that a law cannot be passed and upheld by the High Court that says that an MK under indictment can't become prime minister, because then, of course, he can't become prime minister as he is now under indictment. So Netanyahu was very interested in this issue of judges, and Gantz said that that was the thing he was not willing to back down on. And so it looked like negotiations were going to stall. Gantz's mandate to form a government actually expired last week, and starting last week, we were now in this period where any member of Knesset had 21 days to try and form a 61 or more seat government. And if that didn't happen, there was going to be a 4th election. Today, Gantz and Netanyahu announced that they came to an agreement. The agreement is that Netanyahu is prime minister for the first 18 months. Gantz becomes then prime minister for the next 18 months. And then after those 36 months, new elections are automatically called. The cabinet ministries are split between Likud and Blue and White. But Gantz agreed that starting July 1st, annexation proposals can come before the cabinet and the Knesset, and they have to be voted upon. They cannot be waived or postponed or sandbagged by the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, which will be controlled by Blue and White. He also basically agreed to a deal which gives Netanyahu a veto on the Judges Selection Committee. It still operates the same way in terms of the 9 members, but it will have of the 2 ministers, one has to be a Likud minister, and of the 2 members of Knesset, one has to come from Likud, and one is Tzvi Hauser, one of those 2 very right-wing members of Blue and White. So effectively, Netanyahu has very right-wing members who have a veto on the Judicial Selection Committee. The deal also gives Netanyahu a veto over any senior justice ministry appointments. And the reason that is very critical is because the positions of Attorney General and State Attorney are going to expire within the next year. Netanyahu, since the attorney general in the Israeli system, it's for Americans, it's confusing. The attorney general there, although maybe not as confusing in the Trump era, the attorney general in Israel operates both as the government's top legal advisor, but also as a person who decides whether to, for instance, indict a prime minister. So Netanyahu wants to make sure the next attorney general is somebody who is sympathetic to him, because he is still, I think, hoping perhaps to make some of these indictments go away, but certainly to have a situation where he can negotiate a favorable plea bargain for himself. And also the state attorney who decides whether to bring charges, he wants to make sure the state attorney is somebody he can live with as well. So Gantz agreed to give Netanyahu a veto over those things. Basically, all of the red lines that Gantz had set over the past year, sitting with a prime minister under indictment, preventing annexation, making sure that the justice, sort of the judicial branch is independent, he basically caved on all of those. And most critically, and I'll end with this, and then we can get to questions. Over the last 2 weeks, one of the sticking points between Gantz and Netanyahu was that Gantz wanted some sort of guarantee written into law that if Netanyahu became prime minister for the first 18 months and then they rotated, that if Netanyahu went back on the agreement during those first 18 months, if he decided to dissolve the Knesset and call new elections, that Gantz would automatically become prime minister. Under the agreement they signed today, no law is going to be passed that says that. The agreement, says as an agreement between the two parties that after 18 months, Gantz becomes prime minister, and if the government gets dissolved before that, that the Gantz will become interim prime minister then. But this has no force of law. This is simply a piece of paper between two men, and if Netanyahu decides that he's going to cancel the agreement and call early elections, there's no reason to expect that he will, honor the part of the agreement that says that Gantz becomes interim prime minister. So really all the things that Gantz had been demanding, he's decided to cave on, and we'll see if 18 months from now he becomes prime minister or not. If I were a betting man, I'd be betting not, but clearly Gantz has made a different bet. So with that, happy to expand on any of that, or take any other questions on anything at all.
All right, terrific. Thank you so much, Michael. Just as a reminder, I think the Q&A box is open, so you can type any questions that you have in there, and it looks like some questions are coming in. But before we begin, I'll just quickly remind everyone that you can email Brian as well if you're calling in, and that's at bthang@network2020.org. And really quickly, Michael, would you mind just expanding a little bit on, this is a question that we talked about when we were doing our prep call the other week. Why should we in the United States care, and what makes this election important for us who are sitting so far away and often don't see beyond our own borders?
So it's a great question. There are a bunch of reasons. First of all, obviously the U.S.-Israel relationship is an important one. It's important not just to policy, where of course Israel is an important ally of the United States in the Middle East. It's also obviously very important to politics. Israel is always a campaign issue. During the current presidential campaign, really even before the campaign, I'd say over the last during the course of the Trump administration, Israel has been in political news a lot as a political issue. Whether people are talking about any type of Israeli-Palestinian agreement, whether people are talking about U.S. security assistance to Israel, which is $3.8 billion a year, more than we give to more actually than we give to the rest of the world combined. Politics and the politics of Israel are always a big deal here in the U.S. So, we should care about it for that reason to start. Second, annexation of the West Bank has been a big deal, both in terms of Israeli politics over the last couple of years, but also here, where the Trump administration's Israeli-Palestinian peace plan that was released a few months ago explicitly envisions Israel annexing 30% of the West Bank. Now, as I said before, this had been a sticking point between Netanyahu and Gantz, and the agreement they signed today explicitly says that on July 1st, the Israeli government can begin to advance annexation proposals, and not just any annexation proposals. The coalition agreement explicitly says in conjunction with the Trump administration and the Trump administration peace plan. So the plan put forward by the Trump administration has now actually become an official part of the Israeli government coalition agreement, and that is the blueprint they're going to be using beginning July 1st, when they presumably decide whether or not to annex parts of the West Bank. And so, U.S. politics and policy is now wrapped up in this Israeli government coalition agreement. And if annexation goes forward, it's not just a main issue for Israel, it's going to be an issue for the United States as well. It's going to be a big campaign issue here, but it's also going to impact our ability to operate in the Middle East, because if annexation happens, it very well may threaten the stability of the Kingdom of Jordan. It will almost certainly threaten the stability of the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty. It may end up causing instability in other countries around the region. So, that is something that's going to impact U.S. interests and U.S. security in the Middle East as well. And finally, as we've seen with coronavirus, pandemics and disease don't respect borders. And one of the reasons this has been such a difficult thing is because, of course, coronavirus that starts in China quickly expands elsewhere. And if countries around the world don't do a good job of containing it, it's not going to simply stay in their countries. Now, Israel has done a very good job within its own borders of, as I said before, dealing with coronavirus. But there is coronavirus in the West Bank and Gaza as well. And that's going to be a lot tougher for Israel to handle. And how it handles it really is going to depend on the policies that this new Israeli government takes. And if it isn't able to handle it and make sure that it's contained in the West Bank and Gaza, it's just going to spread in a second wave to the countries surrounding, to Lebanon, to Syria, where, frankly, if there's a second global wave, it's almost certainly going to start in Syria and expand outward throughout the Middle East, and eventually to Europe, and eventually to the United States as well. So, there are a lot of issues that the Israeli government, this new government, is going to be facing from coronavirus to annexation that are going to have an impact not just in Israel, but in the U.S. as well, in U.S. policy and in U.S. politics.
Terrific. No, thank you for explaining that, because it really, I think, makes clear just how critical these elections are. So I'm going to turn to the Q&A box now. And our first question is, who do you see as the post-Gantz leader of the anti-Netanyahu coalition in 18 months, and why?
Great question. And it's already kind of been baked in. It's Yair Lapid. So Yair Lapid is one of the four co-founders of Blue and White. He is the only one of the four that was the head of a party before that, Yesh Atid, which was the main opposition party before. So Lapid at this point, he was the face of the Netanyahu opposition before Blue and White was formed. Now that two of his former partners have joined the government, he all the more so is probably even more vehemently feeling like he's the opposition. So he now is the chairman of the largest opposition party in the Knesset. He is going to be the leader of the anti-Netanyahu coalition. Now, before the establishment of Blue and White, Yesh Atid basically seemed like it had a ceiling of somewhere between 15 and 18 seats in the Knesset that it wasn't able to get past. We'll see what happens. It's possible that 36 months from now, more people will have flocked to Lapid than had been before. It's also possible that we're going to see something of a reordering of Israeli politics, more so around a secular religious divide, because one of the other things that's notable is that Gantz and Ashkenazi, as they enter into this government that will presumably, so right now this new coalition agreement is just between Likud and Blue and White. It remains to be seen which other parties are going to join the government, but everybody expects the ultra-Orthodox parties to join, and I think there's a good chance that Lapid ends up joining forces with Lieberman, who you'll recall from election number one, the former defense minister, who is an ardent secularist, as is Lapid himself. I think there's a good chance that the two of them kind of join forces to try to speak for secular Israelis more writ large. And if that happens, you may see the emergence of a secular party that doesn't really exist now in kind of a bigger way. So we'll see, but for now, it's certainly going to be Lapid. It may end up kind of being Lapid and Lieberman together.
All right, terrific. So our next question is, in the US, it seems like politicians only care about their campaigns during election years and neglect their jobs. Has this prolonged election period negatively impacted Netanyahu's ability to do his job as current prime minister?
So the election period doesn't seem to have impacted his ability to serve as prime minister so much as the saga with indictments has. So really, starting a couple of years ago, ever since it became clear that Netanyahu was under investigation, the thrust of almost everything he's done seems to have been to try and first make the investigations go away, and then to try and forestall any possible indictments by trying to pass immunity laws in the Knesset that would have given him immunity, to now forming a government that is going to give him the ability to impact what type of judges are selected and impact who the next attorney general will be and impact who the next state attorney will be, and to be in a position to deal with these indictments and his trial while he is still prime minister. Now, the reason that was so important to him is that under Israeli law, a minister who is indicted has to immediately resign, with the exception of somebody who serves as prime minister, which is why he has deemed it so important that he remain as prime minister throughout. So, that's been sort of what has what has consumed his time and energy. So, I don't anticipate that's going to change. He has been really the thrust of much of what he's been doing, as I said, has been to deal with his ongoing legal troubles, and assuming that it doesn't get postponed further, a month from now he's actually going to stand trial, and that definitely seems to have taken up a disproportionate amount of his time up until now. When he's actually on trial, presumably that will take up even more time. And it's important to note that even though there is this law, there is this exception in Israeli law that a prime minister under indictment doesn't have to step down, Israel has never gotten to that point, because the only other prime minister who was eventually indicted, Ehud Olmert, resigned before those indictments happened. He resigned as he was on the cusp of indictment. And one of the reasons he resigned was that then opposition leader Benjamin Netanyahu basically led a campaign to say, how can anybody be prime minister under indictment? You're going to be on trial. It's going to be taking up all your time. You're going to be spending hours every day meeting with your attorneys and dealing with a court case, and nobody can possibly serve under those circumstances. And so, really, it's your duty to resign before that happens. So, Netanyahu himself has made this argument that being under indictment really is too time consuming for somebody to then also remain as prime minister. We're going to see how that works in practice. But that really seems to have been more of a distraction for him than the elections have been.
Yeah, and yet it seems by all the signs that you pointed to earlier, he's trying hard to finagle it so that he might be able to stay in his position.
Correct.
Correct. So our next question you did address a little bit, but maybe you might want to take a minute or two to expand on it. And it's what do you think the result of annexation will be in terms of the international community and where Israel stands? And I know you've mentioned a little bit about the region, but also I think that there could come into play maybe U.S.-European relations as well. But if you want to comment on that and take it a little bit more broadly.
So actually, just a couple of days ago, the European Union publicly warned Benny Gantz about making any agreements that would allow annexation to move forward. The EU has always been pretty vehement that they will oppose any type of annexation. The United Nations the same. Now, the United States in the past took that position, obviously, with the Trump plan explicitly allowing annexation of about 30% of the West Bank. Current U.S. government policy, as represented by the White House, of course, is different. But Congress itself has in the past year passed a number of resolutions explicitly voicing its opposition to any unilateral annexation in the West Bank. In terms of what will actually happen, it's a hard question to answer. As I said, the Jordanians will almost certainly suspend, if not cancel, their peace treaty with Israel if annexation includes the Jordan Valley. But how other countries are going to react, I think, is going to depend a lot on what type of reactions there are in their internal populations. If there are protests in neighboring countries, then that's going to drive their reactions. If there aren't, then they'll probably denounce it publicly, but not do anything tangible. I think that if it happens, there's a decent chance that you will see sanctions from the Europeans at some point down the line. But it's hard to predict, and particularly so with coronavirus, because even in a place like Jordan, which is extremely sensitive to something like annexation, with people under lockdown and social distancing, are they going to come out of their house to protest annexation? I'm not sure. The same goes, internally in terms of the West Bank and Gaza. If people would be inclined to come out and protest annexation, that may not be the case while they're worried about catching coronavirus and exposing themselves. So it's really hard to say. What I will say is, leaving aside the response from the international community, and this is a much larger and longer topic. Annexation does threaten Israeli security in many ways, from putting security cooperation with Jordan at serious risk, to putting security cooperation with the PA at risk, to taking on all sorts of internal policing commitments in the West Bank that will stretch the IDF very thin, to risking that the PA itself collapses and then Israel has to sort of go in and own the entire West Bank. So, leaving the reaction from the international community aside, which, as I said, is just difficult to predict anyway, but even more so given the state of the world at the moment, it does create some serious security problems for Israel, irrespective of what the international reaction is.
Terrific, thank you. Yeah, it sounds like timing really is everything now with the coronavirus. So the next question is taking it a little bit away from politics, but how did the general Israeli population react to cell phone surveillance of confirmed and suspected coronavirus patients? And was this move seen as an invasion of privacy, a necessary evil, or an effective way to stop the spread of the virus?
There were some small protests against it. And for those who aren't familiar, at the beginning of this, the Israeli cabinet announced that they were going to be using Israeli cell phones to basically track people who were known to have it and who were known to have COVID-19, and to basically see where they were going and who they came into contact with. There were some small protests against it, but for the most part, so far it seems that Israelis are relatively happy with what the government has done, given that that infections are lower than in other countries. The rate is lower. The morbidity rate is lower. What you're starting to see now is more people upset about the state of the economy than they are about any of the public health issues. And now you're starting to see Israelis call for the economy to be opened up. And then this week, the cabinet announced some loosening of restrictions, and that caused more anger over the groups that were left out of those loosening of restrictions. So, for instance, shops are now allowed to open unless you are a shop in a mall or an open air shop, or unless you're a business like a barber shop or a beauty salon. So, it caused anger among those groups that weren't included in the loosening of restrictions. But in terms of surveillance, Israelis, for the most part, kind of saw it as a necessary if temporary measure.
Okay, great. And the next question also deals with coronavirus, and is where/how did Blue and White fail in taking a leadership role in responding to COVID-19? And perhaps more importantly, where did they fail in taking the initiative to be perceived as leaders among the public discourse?
So I'm not sure I would say that Blue and White failed in terms of taking a leadership role in responding to COVID-19. I think that it would have been tough for Blue and White as an opposition party not in the government during kind of a time of emergency and where nothing can be done on a budget, to come up with any type of alternative plan. I think where they went wrong is by making the determination, and when I say they went wrong, I mean politically, leaving aside whether I think that what they're doing is right or not. Making the determination that joining with the government to fight coronavirus in the short term, or lend their support to the government to deal with coronavirus in the short term, would kind of override all the other concerns they had, right? Blue and White was formed as a party because they had these concerns about Israeli democracy and the direction in which the country was being taken by the prime minister. Those concerns don't disappear because of coronavirus. And, the government seems to be dealing with it in a pretty robust manner. It's not clear to me why joining with the government, unless you're constantly kind of slamming it from the outside, is necessary to continue successfully dealing with coronavirus. I think it's pretty clear that Gantz looked around and made a political calculation, which was he was afraid of what would happen to his party in a fourth election, and decided that he'd rather be inside and have some sort of power as a minister and have this, what I think is a nebulous promise to become prime minister in 18 months, than he would to just go to a fourth election and potentially be irrelevant entirely. So I don't think it's a failure of taking a leadership role in responding to COVID-19. I think it's much more of a failure to stick to political principles and decide that that those are less important than actually joining the government and sort of enjoying the spoils.
Well, that makes this next question all the more relevant. Public perception in comparison to Netanyahu.
In general, Gantz is seen as a nice kind of a nice guy, somebody who jumped into politics because he cared about the country. But he is seen as somebody who has been steamrolled by Netanyahu kind of throughout. In the beginning, I think it was to his benefit that he wasn't viewed as a normal kind of typical politician. People also thought that he didn't have enough of a killer instinct, but they kind of respected him as principled. I think the problem now is that people still don't see him as being a politician with a killer instinct, but the reputation he had for being principled was kind of out the window. Now, I actually don't doubt that he decided to enter into these unity government talks because he thought that he was doing what was right for the country. I think he wanted to avoid fourth elections, not only because he knew that Blue and White would do worse, or suspected that Blue and White would do worse, but also because he genuinely thought that a fourth election would be expensive and unnecessary, and he wants to pass a budget to deal with Corona. But the public perception of him now is very much that he kind of he caved on tactics, and that he also decided that all the principles that he talked about for a year were now all of a sudden not so important. So I don't think that Gantz is going to be on the political scene very long. As I said, I don't think he'll be prime minister in 18 months. And frankly, I'll be surprised if 18 months from now, he is even still head of a party or running for Knesset.
All right. So the next question is, what measures is Israel taking to stop the spread of coronavirus in the West Bank and particularly Gaza?
So far, there's been a decent amount of cooperation between Israel and the PA in the West Bank, and even between Israel and Hamas and Gaza. Israel has been sending medical supplies and tests, has very much limited its incursions into the West Bank, security incursions into the West Bank, and for the most part has been letting the PA deal with things. But you have to remember, the Gaza is controlled by Hamas, which is a terrorist group that is fundamentally, obviously, at odds with Israel. And the West Bank is under Israeli military occupation. So the amount of freedom that the governing authorities have in the West Bank or in Gaza to deal with things is very much limited based on what Israel is kind of willing to let happen. Now, as long as the cooperation between Israel and the PA continues in the West Bank as it has been, I think that Israel will probably be pretty successful at limiting things in the West Bank to the extent possible, although important to note that medical facilities in the West Bank are obviously not nearly as good as they are inside of Israel. In Gaza, it's trickier because while Israel has been letting medical equipment in and sending coronavirus or COVID tests into Gaza, there's only so much that can happen between Israel and Hamas. And obviously the situation in Gaza starts off from a much lower point in terms of the capabilities Gaza has in terms of, hospitals, doctors, medical equipment, the things you would need to run tests and care for people, and ventilators and all of that. So I expect that things in Gaza are going to get pretty hairy. I also expect that we're not necessarily going to even know how hairy they get, because Hamas also has an interest in downplaying the spread of coronavirus in Gaza, because they want to keep a tight lid on things. And, you know, it also may be that because Gaza is under blockade, that while things in Gaza get pretty bad, they may be confined to Gaza. So, you know, we'll see what happens. But, you know, so far, Israel has been coordinating with the Palestinians in both places, you know, really to the greatest extent that that you would expect under these conditions.
All right, and our last question is a follow-up to the annexation question from earlier, and it is, what do you think the internal Israeli reaction to annexation will be?
So I think it's going to depend on the scope of annexation, and I think it's going to depend on kind of what the immediate fallout is. In terms of the scope of annexation, you know, if the Israeli government ends up annexing areas, the areas that are designated under the Trump plan, those are areas for the most part that are kind of in the Israeli consensus, because they are the large blocks along the Green Line and the Jordan Valley. And Israelis have come to think of those as basically being part of Israel anyway. You know, because so many of the Israelis who live over the Green Line live in those blocks, and because those blocks have always been talked about as land swaps in any deal between Israel and the Palestinians that Israel will keep. So for a lot of Israelis, if you say, you know, hey, we're going to annex Ma'ale Adumim or Gush Etzion or the Jordan Valley, that's not a big deal to many Israelis, right? They think of that as kind of logical. If it goes much farther than that to sort of all of Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, you know, that then begins to go into areas that most Israelis don't necessarily think of as anything that is part of Israel that Israel should have to hold on to. And the second part is really based on the fallout. If annexation happens and the PA collapses, then things are going to go very bad for Israel starting on day one. And if that's the case, then all of a sudden annexation, which at the moment, you know, seems to be something that a majority of Israelis will, if they don't necessarily support, will accept if it's confined to the blocks. If it then turns into a security nightmare for Israel, then I think you're going to see that public opinion turn very, very quickly against it. So I think a lot will depend on the circumstances of what gets annexed and what the security fallout is.
All right, terrific. Michael, thank you so much. I really appreciate your taking the time and on a day that's probably really quite busy. As I'm sure you're trying to write and scramble to analyze the latest developments. But I thank you for taking the time. I think everyone who joined us today to hear more about this, you know, clearly there's a lot to watch. And as I explained to Michael the other week, I've found Israeli elections to be so hard to wrap my arms around, and now feel like I have a much better understanding of it. So thank you.
My pleasure. And I would just, you know, if people on the call are interested in more, I'd urge you guys to all check out Israel Policy Forum. We have lots of resources, you know, written resources, podcasts, webinars, all sorts of stuff. And our Young Professionals Network, IPF-IT, is also a great way to engage if you're more interested in these issues.
Oh, terrific. Yeah, that's great to know. And I'll email you separately if you have any writing. We're happy to put it out there on our networks too. And just a reminder to everyone listening, our next call is Wednesday at noon, and that is with Eifert Wirtz on the COVID-19 impacts on energy security and political stability in Middle East and North Africa. So we're staying in the region. And then on Thursday at 12, we have another briefing with Mira Rapp-Hooper on geopolitics after coronavirus. So a lot going on this week. Please join us. And we're happy. Please, you know, do let friends and others know as well. So thank you all for joining, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks so much.
Okay, bye-bye.